Okay, welcome to the 98th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Professor Paul Gilbert, OBE. Paul is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Derby and the founder of Compassion Focused Therapy, CFT. He is also the best-selling author of Overcoming Depression and The Compassionate Mind. Professor Gilbert has published 23 books and over 300 academic papers and book chapters. As a leading researcher and practitioner, Paul's groundbreaking work has provided compelling evidence for the role of compassion in understanding and alleviating our own suffering and that of others. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Piers. Thank you for inviting me to the 98th episode.
Pleasure. Well, how I love to begin the podcast is for you to share a bit about your journey. How did you get into the work that you now do? What inspired you?
Well, interestingly, like you, I think from an early age, I was kind of interested in some of the contemplative traditions. I grew up in the era of the Beatles and the Maharishi and all of that. So that gave us our first tasting. And then at university, I got a little bit into mindfulness, not very much, but a little bit. And then gradually from there over the years, I've become more and more interested in Buddhist psychology and the idea about observing one's own mind and that sort of thing. And then in 2006, there was a big meeting of neuroscience and Buddhists in Samiling, which is a monastery. And met up with a Buddhist monk there, somebody called Chodin. And we talked over the years, a lot about the interactions between how we could have a scientific understanding of compassion and the Buddhist understanding of compassion and the pathway to compassion. And we wrote a book in 2013 called Mindful Compassion. So that was the Buddhist part of it. I've been interested in that. And then the other part of it is that I was a clinical psychologist and doing a lot of work. My area, I did my PhD in Edinburgh in the 70s, and my area was depression, and learnt cognitive therapy. Now, cognitive therapy is a way in which people are invited to explore the stream of thoughts that go through their mind. It's called automatic thoughts, the kind of things they focus on and ruminate, and learn not to get so caught up in them, but to stand back and try and think if there are alternative ways of thinking. And clients can do that. But for some clients, it didn't always work that well. And we had one particular person who taught me so much and for whom I'm so grateful, who had very bad depression. But she'd made a good marriage and she had 3 lovely children. She could look at that and say, well, look, I feel I'm a failure, but actually my marriage is good and I've held down a job and I've got 3 lovely children. She said, I know that, but I still feel I'm a failure and still feel pretty useless and no good, really. So I said to her, I don't know what else to say. I said to her, well, when you feel these things, when you look at the evidence for them, you can see that that's not quite true. Your family loves you and all that. How are you saying that in your mind? How do you actually hear that in your mind? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, speak it out as you hear it. So she said, okay. Come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got a husband who loves you. You got 3 lovely children. You've got a lot to be grateful for. So I suddenly realized, oh my God, the emotional tone of this lady's thing was very hostile, very critical. And I started to ask other clinical clients, when you're trying to reevaluate your thinking or look at it in a different way, what is your emotional tone? And the emotional tone was either quite cold or quite hostile. So the obvious thing to do was not so clever, really. Say, okay, let's just create a compassion tone, a friendly, supportive tone, so that you hear those thoughts like, you've had depression that's been very difficult for you, and you've done ever so well because you've managed to create a very good relationship with your husband, despite all the things that happened to you. And she said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that, she said. I've never been kind to myself. I can't see the point of it. That seems a bit, no, I can't see that that's going to help me. Just having this sort of soft voice. Are you serious? We actually use her in training. That she's lovely. She's got this no, it's ridiculous. I'm not doing it. So that was the second shock. The first shock was realize how hostile people are when even when they're trying to be helpful to themselves. The second shock was actually when you try to help them develop compassionate, kind, gentle, supportive, empathic voice, they really didn't want to do it. And the third shock was when they did start to do it. Oh boy, did that open up the gates of compassion. Now, the reason for that is because every motivational system carries its own trauma. So if you like going on holidays, you're an explorative sort of person, and then one day you get very badly beaten up, sent home in an ambulance or something. The next time you hear about holidays, your trauma memory will be triggered. You won't remember all the nice times. The first thing that will hit you will be trauma because your threat system is your, first point of call. It's like, coming into a country, your first port of call are the sort of, security guards. Can we let you in, sort of thing. So the trauma is very easily if you think of your sexual system, you have a horrible sexual experience, and that can be triggered when you have a arousal. But it's the same for the caring system. If in your caring system you have traumas, people that should have been kind, supportive, and understanding to you weren't, they were neglectful or hostile or whatever way. When you start to engage with compassion, that's what starts to bubble forward. You run into the traumas in the care system, and so you have to detoxify those traumas. And underneath that, then you have to work for the raging about what happened, but also the intense grieving and the yearning, because all children are born needing and wanting and yearning to be loved. And when they start to work with the traumas of not feeling loved, it produces a lot of grieving and yearning, which can be very painful for people. So the road into compassion is not sort of simply let's just be kind to ourselves and blah blah blah. The road to compassion is developing a really strong courage and wisdom to go into areas that are extremely painful because of what's happened to you.
Thank you. How fascinating. I can resonate with all of those aspects. So, as I mentioned before we started recording, I spent 3 years in a Buddhist monastery. And during that time, I had a breakdown. And I went through those 3 stages. I was very hostile, basically physically beating myself. And then I learned to bring a more compassionate voice in. And then the tears came. And I cried almost solidly for 2 years while that came. So, thank you. Thank you so much for.
Yeah, and the crying is a yearning to come out of emptiness and loneliness.
Mm, 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 mm.
The loneliness that's associated with that crying is horrific for some people.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love for you to share a little bit. I've listened to other podcasts. You share a bit about your childhood. I'd love for you to share a bit about growing up in, I believe it was Africa, and then moving to boarding school.
Yeah, well, I had a very disruptive childhood indeed. So I have all the classics, trauma tags. Um, my father was he was an RAF mechanic, actually, a Spitfire. He was a Spitfire mechanic. Just a young guy, 20, 21, whatever it was, because his father owned a lot of garages on the south coast of Rolls-Royce and Bentley garages. So he grew up as a mechanic. So he was a very good mechanic. So he was a Spitfire mechanic and got very traumatized in lots of different ways. And so he was a traumatized dad. All right. So after the war, he decided he didn't want to stay in the UK with all the memories and also wanted to go make some money. So he went to Africa and was building roads and looking after all of the heavy earth moving equipment, the bulldozers and all that. He looked after all that stuff. And so that was that. And then we would go out and come back. So I was born in what was then the Gambia. And then we came back and then we went back again. And when I was about 3 years old, I was back in England, but unfortunately he was involved in a very bad fire. They've been building, they've been burning the bush back and stuff like that. And somebody put petrol on it, not intentionally, but hadn't told him. So he was lucky though because he wasn't so scarred. But as a result of that, my mother got an emergency call, and so she left for 6 months because he was in hospital a long time in Africa. So I was looked after by my aunt, So that was, and then when my mother came back, I thought, who the hell are you? Sort of thing, And then when my father came back a year after that, well, who the hell are you? So, from an early um, experience, there was quite a lot of disruptions and all kinds of stuff. And my dad, bless his heart, he really wanted to be a good father, but his temper could be quite aggressive at times. So then they left and they went to Nigeria, got a better job, and then we all went off to Nigeria. For a couple of years, I was lived there, quite a few years actually, can't remember exactly. And we had home schooling, but I was out and about most of the time. And then we moved to a place in Nigeria called Jos, and I went to an American missionary school, which actually I loved. In fact, it was great. It was, because the climate was great. We were out playing basketball all the time, and the people but it was somebody I met up in Australia who I went to school with in Nigeria, which is quite interesting. So I had a great time, and we got hammered with right-wing Christian beliefs, though. So when I came back to this country, I had a very strong Texan accent. I believe in God. I believe in the Bible. Um, but it was decided then that when I got to 11 years old, ready for secondary school, there were British Commonwealth scholarships for overseas people like my father. So they applied for a scholarship and got me into a boarding school at the age of 11. And that was that. And boarding schools in those days in the early 60s were quite tough places, really. So, I mean, nowadays, some of those people would be in prison. Used to get beaten. I used to get beaten a lot because I was a bit of a rebel. I'd only been there a few days. I was 11 years old, I think. Yeah, I was 11 years old. I think I've been there about 2 weeks. And we were in these dormitories. I think there were about six on one side, six on the other, and then there'd be a dormitory prefect that would come to bed later. So we used to have to go to bed about 7:30. I'd only been there a few things, and then this person bursts in the room with a cane. Turn it off, the lights out. That's it. Everyone over the bed. So we all had to get over the bed, bent over, and got caned. And so then, of course, with this caning, your bum turned purple. But then we all compared our bums, who had the most purple bum. And you got through this shit, basically, by the relationship you have with the guys around you. And I was very lucky because my year was extremely affiliative. We got on very well. The year above me was okay, but my year was a very affiliative year, and we were very supportive of each other and got on very well. So my relationship with other guys has always been good. If you get other guys to support each other. The trouble is a lot in the world today, other guys compete too much with each other, they don't support each other. But when they can do support each other, that's really, really, really good. So anyway, so that was that. And of course, throughout the years, I would be done for smoking and this bike sheds and all kinds of stuff, but get caned and things. But that was the same for a lot of people in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, I think.
Thank you. Did that experience impact in any way the work you went into with?
Yes, I'm sure it did. I mean, and it's always, I've never done very well with authority. I've always had a fuck you to authority, actually, unless you're going to be on the ball. So I've always been a bit of a rebel, and that's why in my work, I wrote a book in the 80s called Human Nature and Suffering on the evolution of suffering in mind. People say, oh, don't do that, evolution. Oh, no, it's not. You don't want to go there. So I said, oh, don't do it. And then when I started the work on compassion in the 80s and 90s, people said, oh, no, stay with cognitive therapy. Oh, you don't want to start talking about compassion. Oh, no, fuck that. I want to do what I want to do. So I've always kind of followed my own canoe, and I've never really wanted to. I've always sort of stayed slightly on the margins of things, so I'm very happy here in Derby rather than going to a big university or something like that. But that's just, that's how I am.
Thank you. Thank you. Interestingly, when I was at boarding school, I was more of a complier, following all the rules. but since I had my breakdown in my 20s, I've become more of a rebel. So
Yeah.
I somehow flipped. I don't know how that happened, but
Oh,
so
I can be a submissive, you know, I can be very manipulative. I can be quite submissive and if it's in my interest to be submissive, you know.
mm, yeah, yeah, I think I can resonate with that. So I'd love for you to go into a little bit more depth about compassion focused therapy. You know, you've described a little bit about how it began, but if you'd love, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what it is, and how does it differ from regular therapy?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I mean, the point is we call it compassion focused therapy, not compassion therapy, because it's how we focus some of the other interventions that other therapies have, like cognitive behavior. We use a lot of cognitive behavior therapy, but we use it in a slightly different way at times, not always. So issues where people have got uh, issues with anxiety, we know exposure and helping people to expose. But we find that if people generate a compassionate, supportive inner tone when they're engaging in exposure rather than just pure exposure, it helps them. And that's partly because the compassion motivational system stimulates particular physiological aspects of our brains and bodies, which actually help to settle the threat system. But let me go back to your question. So anyway, there we are. So I'm starting off beginning to recognize that even when people were trying to be helpful, they were often quite hostile. Now, of course, we knew for a long time that when people were struggling, they would be hostile to themselves. You know, most people who've got mental health problems, their hostility is turned against themselves. Their raging is inwardly directed, and that's usually, or not always, comes from having to take up submissive positions as a child. You'll be interested in this because of your spiritual interests. But if you look at, say, deity-based religions, take the Aztecs, for example, they're a classic case. In order to placate their gods in the sky, they have to perform certain functions, which was to sacrifice subjects. Now, what would happen was they'd sacrifice all these poor souls, and then if the following year the rains didn't come, they wouldn't go and complain. They wouldn't go onto the altar and say, "Oi, you cheating bastards, we've just sacrificed you. Send the bloody rains. Otherwise, we're going to find another god." You know, they didn't do that. What they did was, what have we done wrong?
Mm.
Maybe we didn't sacrifice enough. So as soon as you've got deity-based processes that you have to appease, then you're in trouble. And that's true in families as well. As soon as you're having to appease out of fear, then you have to suppress your rage, you know, because if you don't, then you will be very seriously or can be very seriously injured if you do, if you, and so on. And we see religions around the world now that are all doing this appeasing stuff. You know, I'll be horrible to you, and then God will love me. I mean, it's a horrible thing, but it's part of what humans do. It's this appeasing punitive authorities. So when we appease punitive authorities, we're either horrible to other people or horrible to ourselves. And learning to kind of get rid of that is really very, very important. But it is a struggle because, you know, if you're a submissive, you're kind of taking on board the fact that you're not worthy or you're not good enough or you don't have a right to do that. So that was key, and helping clients with that and helping them realize and working through some of the fears about being compassionate. That was really what the therapy was about. So before people could be compassionate, you had to deal with the fears and the blocks to being compassionate. So that's how that therapy. So we were using CBT, we were using some psychodynamic concepts, using the concepts, but we always tried to create the conditions where people would find the courage and wisdom to be able to support themselves on that journey. So when you take a journey into the shadow or into the dark side, it can be a little bit scary. It can be very scary, actually. But if they have that compassion orientation, that real desire to address suffering wherever it exists, that helps them.
Mm. Thank you, thank you. So, for example, that lady you spoke to, who was really struggling to be nice to herself. So I've never been kind because I see this a lot with my clients, which are ex-boarders who have a very critical, toxic inner critic. If you have someone who's like, I've never been kind, how do you invite that in to be more compassionate?
Well, the first thing is we do FBRs, fears, blocks, and resistance. The first thing is to say, okay, so what is your fear about being kind? If you could be kind, what would? And then you get, it's weakness. Okay, so what's your fear about being? It's a CBT, Socratic questioning, really. Okay, so what's your fear of being weak then? Blah 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 blah. So you try to always see that this rejection of compassion is fear-based. It's
Mm,
always fear-based. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Blah blah. Why not? Well, because that's weak, it's stupid, and pathetic. I'm not doing that, or whatever it is. But underneath, there is that fear. At some point, it will come to the fact that I will be seen as rejectable. I will be seen as nothing. I will be seen as weak. I'll be seen as undesirable. At some point, you will get to this fear of being isolated, rejected, pushed away. It's the sort of Garden of Eden phenomena, isn't it? God turns his back and we're all expelled and doesn't want to bother with us anymore because we've done this terrible thing. So that's working with people who push it away, and they are frightened to do the grief work because
mm,
they sense as soon as they start to go there, their inner wisdom of the fact that connectedness is the center of everything, whether you're in the Buddhist position, actually, or whether you're in a biological position. Biologically, we are designed as hunter-gatherers to live in small interconnected groups. But even if you don't get out to the biological way, if you go into the Buddhist position of no self,
mm,
it's not a loss of the self, it's an expansion of the self, right? It's you become one of it with everything. It's interconnectedness again. So whether you're looking at the nature of mind itself, the yearning for returning to the state of interconnectedness, or whether you look at it from a biological point of view, at the root of both of them is this deep sense of interconnectedness and the fighting with loneliness and disconnection.
Thank you.
It's a real fear. People have a real fear of going there. They really are really frightened of it, and they will push you away and push you away. I'm not doing compassion,
Mm,
this compassion stuff. Teach me how to be strong. Teach me how to have self-esteem. But fuck you, I'm doing all those compassion shit. What are you talking about? So, we work in the prisons a lot, and that's very common. This pushing away,
mm.
and it's some of the people in the prisons have learned that only if they can frighten you are they safe. They
Yeah.
can't frighten you, they're not safe with you. And
Mm,
so they're constantly intimidating people around them, bullying people around them, because if they don't see fear in your eye, they don't feel safe. So all that stuff, compassion has to cut through that stuff, and it can be quite painful and difficult for people.
thank you. Yeah, yeah. I see that a lot, this not wanting to go into the grief. I almost see that, especially if we've suppressed, as we often do in Britain, is like we have a reservoir of emotion
Yeah,
and we're very frightened of letting the walls down. And what I try to say to people is we don't want to let the wall down. We just want to let the sluice gate and let a little bit out
yeah.
gradually. What do you find works really well for people who have been so frightened of allowing the tears up, who even after years will go, no, I'm not feeling this?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question. So therapeutically, we call it empathic bridging. Empathic bridging is very important. And so when you have these clients who are like this, who've got this thing, and so from the therapist, it's defensive, that actually behind it is, as you say, this real yearning for connectedness, because that's what we're built for. We're biologically built for it. But if you take the Buddhist position, we're even our minds are built for it, because we are wanting to become. We have a sense in which we more than just this sort of brain thing. Is empathic bridge. So empathic bridging is really simply empathically bridge to them all the time, right? So they say, like with this lady, she'd say, well, my adopted mother used to beat me and send me to my room, and I'd be left there. And I'd say to her, so that must have been a terribly distressing, frightening, and lonely experience. And she'd say, yeah, I suppose it was, but you just had to get on with it, right? I see. So the next day, I remember a time when I was going to have a birthday party, and then mum had one of her rages and decided she wasn't going to do it. So all the kids were invited, but she wouldn't let them in. That must have been very horrible for you. Yeah, I suppose it was, but that sort of thing happened all the time, you know what I mean? So every time you do an empathic connection, they go, but the point is you are holding the pain they don't want to feel.
Mm.
And they are seeing that they're experiencing you empathically bridging in repeatedly, repeatedly, repeatedly. And if you watch them over time, you'll start to see changes in their facial expression and changes in how they quickly they reject you. And it's a very slow process. It's like, as Russell Colt says, it's like thawing prawns. You don't want to thaw them too quickly because then they just go to mush. You have to thaw them slowly. And so what you see is this gradual softening, this gradual, because you're constantly coming back to this. You're constantly reflecting that to them. You're constantly saying this, of course you're going to feel that. Of course you're going to feel that. Of course you're going to feel that. And over time, you'll see them start to change. And with this particular lady, she told us one story, and then I said that must have been very painful. And at that moment, you could see the tears started to come. And she said, yes, it was. Yes, yes, it was. And the voice goes, and that's it.
Yeah, thank you. What would you say when we have this cultural thing around boarding school that it's a privilege? And that's what I often hear people they won't connect to the feeling because, oh, it was good for me, because that's what they were told as children. Oh, it costs a lot of money. And that is the disconnect, especially if it's societal. What do you feel around that?
What do I feel around that? Or
What do we do? If we've got someone who's feeling that, who's, they've had it from society and from their parents, and therefore they won't connect in with the emotions of
yeah.
how it was not to have mum and dad around, or to be bullied, or to be have corporal punishment.
Yeah. Well, the key thing really is you and I both know that as hunter-gatherer society, with millions of years, our brains evolved for close connected. We live with maybe groups of 50 or 150, maybe, according to Robin Dunbar. And you'd know everybody from the day you were born to the day you would die. You'd have very strong connections to your parents. You didn't always know who your father was, but you'd have strong connections to the males in the community and so on and so on and so on. That's what we're biologically. We are not biologically designed at the age of 11 to suddenly find ourselves in a group of total strangers with no adults that we have loving connections to at all, and having to then exist in these peer groups with kids we've never seen before. I mean, it is a nonsense. It's a ridiculous psychology, absolutely stupid. But in capitalist societies where you have elites and privilege and power and wealth. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Your child is an object of wealth creation. That's all we're interested in, that they have an education that they can create wealth. This our society. We're not interested in whether they have good empathic skills or they are moral. Who cares about that? Are they going to be able to compete in the society that's all about wealth and selfishness?
Mhm.
So that's the issue, right? And these parents are not, they're not, they themselves are trapped in the same psychology. It's not that they believe they're doing good. It's not that they know they're doing bad. It's they believe they're doing good. I mean, some, of course, are disconnected from their kids. They wouldn't know how to relate to a child at any point because they are always disconnected from themselves. But a lot of the parents believe they're doing, my parents believe they were doing good.
Mhm.
They certainly didn't believe they were causing me trouble. They thought it really be, I was very lucky to have a scholarship to get educated in that way. And in a lot of ways, of course, I've been able to do what I've been able to do because I had a good education. So, it's important to see that the stream goes both ways in the sense that yes, it is true that a lot of people in boarding school are privileged and they do get into the governments and they do get into the top echelons of society. The trouble is getting in there. They're so unempathic that they cause so much damage once they're there. That's the problem. But you know all this.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of Professor Antonio Damasio, who says we cannot make good decisions without emotional information.
Yeah,
It's like, how can we be a leader without empathy,
yeah,
without compassion? without feeling.
But how can we be a good leader? We can certainly be a leader without, in fact, in some, we have societies, and we've ever since we created wealth through agriculture, and our groups got bigger, and then we created, the empires, the Vikings, the Romans, all of them, Syrians, the Egyptians, all the same, where you have these elite, mostly dominant male, aggressive males. We're in trouble, right? And that's how societies have been since really the years of agriculture. Dominant male, elites, controlling populations, high, the Romans, 30% of the Romans were slaves.
Wow.
Slavery was massive in all of these. It's only recently we've started to take on board that slavery is a crime against humanity, but up until just a few hundred years ago, not at all. So the degree of callousness and cruelty is extraordinary, but it's partly to do with the ways in which we have created these hierarchical elite power cultures and just let the elites get away with whatever they want to get away with,
Mm.
including running slavery and torturing people and treating women like crap. I mean, it's terrible. But the point is, and one of the things that you're doing, which is terrific, is to highlight the fact that, if you have come from this, you don't need to continue it. You can need to say enough is enough. I demand our compassionate right. We are one of the few species that can be compassionate in the way that we can. We have medicine, for God's sakes. We invented vaccines. We have got a fantastic compassion capacity. Don't screw it up with your competitive capitalistic shit, basically. Uh, that's what we need to say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're making a documentary at the moment called Boarding on Insanity, bringing that to light to
Yes,
ask,
that's right.
well, what are our leaders, if we have leaders who have no compassion, how's that going to impact us?
Yeah, and absolutely, they don't. And I mean, if you look all around the world now, look at all of the areas where you've got the wars and the things like that, absolute callousness.
Mm,
Absolute callousness, no sensitivity at all. It's not to take sides because usually both sides are involved in the stuff, but it's horrific. And until we wake up as a species and decide actually, we have a terrible dark side. We are vicious. We are one of the nastiest species that have ever existed. If you think about the Roman games, if you think about the tortures we've invented, the millions of people around the world today that are dying because they're being tortured to death,
mm,
for God's sake, humans, wake up, please. You're being run by demons, demon minds.
mm,
Now, you don't need to do that, but there are ways in which we can, for example, enforce the rule of law. When the United Nations was set up in 1945, it was a fantastic
mm,
organization, wonderful document. If you read the 21 points or whatever it was, but they set it up in such a way they were always going to be defeated because they set it up with the elites. You know, Russia, USA, China, and those allowed them just to veto. Well, that was the end of the game. You could not impose a rule of law. And because we had not been able to impose a rule of law, it doesn't matter what laws we pass. And there are certain parts of the country where people have just simply ignored it time after time. So the rule of law becomes extremely important in societies. And the better your rule of law, provided it follows a sense of social justice, the better your society. If we don't have it, then you have places like, some of the drug cartels and Haiti and all these other places where if the rule of law breaks down, it's humans are vicious.
mm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so true. I've been reading Caroline Elkin's book, Legacy of Violence, about the British Empire. And she said, I was just going to start writing a book, just a little bit about Kenya. And it's about that thick because she just found there was so much the British Empire that was violence. And, I feel we don't look at this stuff. And I feel it's really important for us to explore, let it up,
Yeah,
like they did in South Africa.
yeah, yeah,
the,
yeah.
Bring it up and then let it go. But we won't look at it. So
And the problem is because we keep thinking of ourselves as a tribe, not as humans. Look, the fact of the matter, humans do this all the time. I mean, you look at all the great empires, look what the Romans did, right? I mean, they, and so on and so on. You look at why do Brazilians speak Portuguese? Because they were taken over by the Portuguese. Portuguese ripped them off. Why do Argentinians speak Spanish? Because we invaded the Americas. Look what's happened to the Native American Indians, right? We just ripped off their lands. China moved into Tibet, just took it over. What's happening in Gaza, right? I mean, it's not because these people are Jewish or they're British or whatever they are. Humans are a piece of shit if you let them be it, right? If you give them power, that's how they typically use it, unless you also find ways in which you can build in the limitations of the power elites, because it's the power elites that drive these horrific things that happen in history. And humans have always done this. They've always marched into other people's countries and taken over. I mean, the Julius Caesar instigated a complete ethnic cleansing in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Extraordinary. I mean, the Gothic cultures were just wiped out. So it's not new. Humans do this stuff, and it could be the British, it could be Russia's just moved into Ukraine. I mean, so it's not about being British, it's not about being Jewish, it's not about being American or whatever it is. It's about what humans do. It's a human trait. If you give humans power in certain contexts, they will try and steal from others. That's what they will always done and will always do. And that's why the United Nations Charter of Rights was so important. It was the first time it was actually written, we agree that we will not steal other people's territories and lands. We can have a war of defense, but we will not. But that's just not being observed.
Mm, yeah, thank you.
I get passionate about these things.
Yeah, I hear it and I so agree. It's really lovely to see that.
I think the key thing for me, Piers, is that, there's a lot of stuff going on the internet now. Compassion is all about love and all this stuff. That's a load of rubbish. Humans are capable of fantastic compassion, but they also have a terrible dark side. And you need the courage of compassion to stand against that dark side. Because if you don't, humans do terrible things, right?
Mm.
Unbelievable things.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think Jordan Peterson talks about he recommends everyone reads the Gulag Archipelagos, which is the stories of what happened in the gulags. Uh,
Yeah,
just
terrible.
people can see what we have done.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the British should know better than anyone else.
Yeah,
When we get vicious, we are vicious.
yeah,
Look
yeah.
at look at the Inquisition. Look at the treatment of witches. I mean, where do you want to start?
Yeah, 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 it's true. So how do we, I mean, you've spoken a bit about compassion focused therapy. What about if, as an individual, I want to cultivate more compassion? I'm maybe very hard on myself or maybe hard with my partner. How, in your research, what's really helped people to become more compassionate?
Well, I think it's a great question. The first thing is understanding what compassion is and what it isn't. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense out there about what compassion is and what it isn't. Compassion is a motive to address suffering, basically. That's what it is. I want to address suffering. In the Buddhist position, as you know, it's the motivation is may all sentient beings be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. That's basically the Buddhist Mahayana view, the motivation, and that we then become enlightened in order to enlighten others, because part of the suffering in the Buddhist position is because we're ignorant of our true being, which is not this biological mind, but the nature of consciousness. So that's the Buddhist position. And in the evolutionary position, it's again the same thing, the desire to address suffering and the causes of suffering. I don't want I'm going to dedicate myself to that. And so that's what we choose to do. So if we choose to do that, if we take that as a motive, okay, then if we're true to that motive, we have to work out, how am I going to be sensitive to suffering? How am I going to be able to engage with it rather than turn off from it? And how am I going to find the ways to do it? Now, that means there are many, 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 many different forms of it. For example, if you're a firefighter, you will risk your life to save people. That's compassion, right? And the skills that you need, they're not going to be sort of soothing and like going into that fire in a calm mind. You're not going to be doing that. But you need a mind that's focused on the goal of reducing suffering. And that firefighter might risk their lives for you, but they may not be the most empathic father, for example. So there are very different skills that go for compassion. So the first thing is clarity that compassion is this sensitivity, a preparedness to be sensitive to pain and suffering. And there are very different types of pain and suffering. And we can be sensitive to some, but not all, because some of them we've closed down on. And then the second aspect of compassion is the working out what to do. And that's true for all motives. All motives are based on the algorithm of if A, do B. So if there's a threat, then I run away. If it's food, then I approach it. If it's a sexual experience, and that changes my physiology for that. So the brain is set up for if this occurs, then that will occur. If this occurs, that will occur. And compassion is the same, where we become sensitive to suffering, then we become moved by the suffering of others, and that motivates us to want to do something. But both of them require a courage and a wisdom, okay? Because without wisdom, you might want to be helpful, but you're reckless. You just jump in. We often give the example, you see somebody fall into a river and you think, I must save them. So you jump in, but you've got your Wellington boots on and you can't swim. So it's a good motive, but it's not very wise. So the key thing then with compassion, right, is this wisdom, this preparedness to acquire the wisdom to understand suffering and its causes. And that means how we understand it within ourselves, how we engage it within ourselves. But the second thing is then working out what is the healing path? What is the path of prevention? So we're going to look at compassion in the world. What is the path of prevention of the dark side? Because Star Wars, beware of the dark side, Luke.
Yeah,
But it's true. I mean, it's been known to be true for thousands of years that the human dark side is really powerful and problematic. So the wisdom is then, what do we need to do as individuals and as a species to address the dark side? Though if you discover that you are somebody who, when you become disappointed, or when you become upset, or you're feeling not good with yourself, that you'll launch attacks on yourself, the first thing is to say, okay, let me understand that. So what's behind the attack? If I was to say to my critic, I imagine my critic, hello, critic, what's really worrying you? Why are you attacking me? Supposing I am weak and I am useless, what are you really worried about? What's upsetting you? Where did you come from? Um, then it's really understanding and working with the fear that sits behind the critic. We don't really engage with the critic too much because the critic is a kind of a civil war. You've got a civil war going on. So you don't want to start fighting it because then you just, mess with the civil war in your head. You need to get out of that altogether and get into the compassion. So we have compassion for the critical process. We have compassion for the fear that's driving that degree of rage. And when you begin to have compassion for that fear, that then takes you into the areas where you do your grief work and so on and so on. But that's tough, and it is tough to do without somebody with you. So it's but that's the thing. So it's the courage really to really understand what is driving pain. What is driving pain?
What is driving pain? Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, one of the other things I was looking at a few of your articles, I realized we've got about 6-7 minutes left. You've got Nicola Petrocchi. She's done a lot of research into CFT. I mean, what were her findings?
Yeah, it's yeah. So she's a fantastic researcher and done some wonderful things. But the thing that's most important is the meta-analysis, that they did a big meta-analysis over 7,000 clients, and the findings were that the CFT had a very good impact factor. And so the data is that it's a very effective therapy, as certainly as effective as the other therapies it's been compared with, and if not slightly better. So that's published. People can read it, make their own decisions about it. But we've got research in many different areas. I mean, there's not just us, there are some wonderful researchers all over the world looking at different aspects of compassion. We know now that, experiencing compassion can even change your epigenetics. And we have a study going on in Portugal with somebody called Marcelo Matos, who's doing amazing research looking at epigenetic change associated with compassionate mind training. So and we've got compassion in schools programs, all kinds of programs. So we're doing a lot of research in a lot of different areas, and that's very exciting. Keeps my interest going.
Wow. Sounds like you're doing amazing work. Wow. The kind of in schools, I see that, we need to bring compassion in. We need to bring a different way of, they seem to be, I've worked as a teacher, seem to be very stressed out places for the children.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is getting tighter and tighter, and
Yeah,
especially,
because the competitive, see, the compassion motivation is rooted in the care motivation, right? That's the care motivation. But a lot of what we're doing at the moment is competitive motivational systems, and competitive motivational systems tend to flourish in bigger groups when there's opportunities for big wealth. They don't flourish at all in small hunter-gatherer societies, because in small hunter-gatherer societies, your status was really from your contribution.
mm,
You couldn't grab it and or threaten or bully people to have more status, because then you'd be rejected. Actually, you would be kicked out. Um, and we've actually come from primates, where primate groups are pretty high. Bonobos are a little bit more complicated, but generally speaking, primate groups are run through aggression. And the most aggressive gets to the top, and then the submissive behaviors. So it's because the subordinates are prepared to submit all the time. That's what keeps the peace for the most part. Robert Sapolsky has got some wonderful things to say about this if you want to go and listen to some of his work that he's done on baboons and things. But then what happened was, probably about 2, maybe 3 million years ago, subordinates started to gang up, and they formed coalitions and alliances against dominance. And the females became involved in those coalitions. And that became such a successful strategy that that's where humans moved off into the coalitions between individuals. And that was great. And that's what helped build our brains, because we love to make contributions. And if you go onto the internet, you'll find people wanting to teach you about everything from, cooking fairy cakes to fixing your car to playing the guitar, because people love to share. We are sharers. We love to share. Um, so that's basically our sort of nature, really. But then comes this competitive dynamic, which is where the opportunities to get more power, more wealth, more power, more wealth, more, and that unregulated is a problem. And capitalism has really done us in that way. I mean, there's always going to be competition, of course there is, but the whole ways in which, particularly the people on the right, think it's okay just to allow resources to flow where the privileged lie, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. But unfortunately, we don't have any leaders at the moment of the 1950s who understood that, and that they, if you think what happened in the 1950s,
mm,
we built a health service that was the envy of the world. We built new universities. We built all of our infrastructure, railways and everything, which were just given away. I mean,
mm,
the right wing's just given them all away, and now they're owned by private companies who, pollute our seas and run down our hospitals. I mean, it is just a nonsense. But there are no leaders now who are prepared to lead for compassion societies. They just don't want to do it. They all want to sort of fiddle around the edges and manage a bit of this and manage a bit of that. But the fact of the matter is, we live in hugely unequal societies, and that's wrong. That's wrong. I mean, football is making £500,000 a month or whatever it is. That's just nuts. That's just nuts. So, um, we need to find ways, we need to find leaders who understand that we need to create societies that are a little bit more like hunter-gatherers, where we can all make a contribution, where people have a sense of responsibility for other people. We create a sense of community. We demand that we have a health service that actually works,
mm,
and so on and so on. But at the moment, we don't have the leaders who are prepared to do that, because the leaders at the moment want to appeal to our pockets and bank accounts, which is fair enough. But we need these. There are no compassion leaders in the world at the moment.
Mm. So we need to start developing them.
We need to demand them, right? We need to demand them. We need to push our politicians, because a lot of them come into politics with good intention. It's not that they're bad people or whatever, but they get caught up in systems. And because you've got the whipping system in politics where you have to comply to the party and all the rest of it, it's very difficult for people to push forward compassionate agendas. There's some wonderful politicians actually. Can't remember the name of the lady that was murdered. But anyway, um, there was a politician a few years ago who was stabbed to death very sadly. But actually, when you looked at the work she was doing, it was extraordinary. She was wonderful. And we don't hear about the wonderful things politicians do. We only hear about the bad things they do. Anyway, I'll just shut up now because I'm ranting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, as we start to wrap up, I really appreciated speaking to you. I mean, any last words, inspiration, vision moving forward?
Yeah, so if you happen to have had a boarding school, look, you are like all of us. We're all yearning for connection. That's the thing. Let's be honest about that. We want to be loved. We want to be wanted, desired. We want to make a contribution. Let's just be honest about what we want. If we can be honest about what we want, and then we can begin to think, okay, well, I don't feel that at the moment. I feel quite alone and no good or whatever. Then let's work on that. And if we learn to be compassionate to that, and to see it's part of what it is to be a male in modern society is actually, it's not our fault. It really is not our fault. We never chose it. But we can decide, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to become a compassionate hero to myself and to others. And I'm really going to address suffering. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to sit on it. I'm not going to allow my critic to keep creating it. I mean, it creates it because underneath it's very frightened. I'm going to work with it.
Beautiful. Become a compassionate hero to yourself and others.
That's right.
I love that.
That's right. That's right.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your work. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, Paul. And yeah, if I can support your work in any way, please let me know.
Piers, you're doing great. Just keep the podcasts going and keep the discussions going. And, people are very welcome to come and visit our website or my website or whatever it is. And we give a lot of there's a lot of free things on the website. So, if you're interested in practicing compassion, there's a lot of practices, breathing practices, visualization practices. They're all free. So you can just go down, download them, have a go with them, and dealing with self-criticism, that sort of thing. And wish you well on your journey.
Thank you. I put into the description links for your website and to purchase your book. So please do, guys, go and buy his books and have a look at the resources. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Piers.
Okay.